Despite the threat posed by COVID-19 in Nigeria, the National Association of Resident Doctors will begin a nationwide strike on Monday, June 15, to press home its demands. In a statement made available to Arise News, National President Dr. Aliyu Sokomba said federal government's unwillingness to address his concerns after a 14-day ultimatum resulted in the association's decision to commence the indefinite industrial action. The demand of the doctors include provision of grossly inadequate appropriate personal protective equipment for all healthcare workers, immediate reversal of illegal disengagement of 26 resident doctors in Jos University Teaching Hospital, payment of all outstanding salaries in line with the provision of Medical Residency Training Act, the universal implementation of Medical Residency Training Act in all federal and state hospitals, and ensuring pay parity among doctors of equal cadre, an immediate implementation of revised hazard allowance and payment of COVID-19 inducement allowance as agreed by the federal government of Nigeria and healthcare workers 3 months ago. Doctor, this has been a ticking time bomb. We've seen this in the works. Constantly conversations around personal protective equipment. We all remember when it was said that the health minister was grilled about allowances being paid to health workers for COVID and the likes and things like that. And his response was not so encouraging. So a lot of people are seeing this coming. It's already here, 15th, couple of days. What's your take on this?
Well, first, ordinary Nigerians are likely to see this as blackmail. The same way many Nigerians have also reacted to the decision of the Academic Staff Union of Universities to go on strike at this time, whatever the issues may be, because it looks like the tactics, the strategy will be like let's hit government when it is in a difficult situation. Can you imagine a situation of health workers going on strike in the face of COVID-19? And in fact, the statement issued by the National Association of Resident Doctors took time out to point out that, look, even doctors in COVID-19 isolation centers will be part of the strike. And they added, we sympathize with Nigerians. So that's one leg of it. The second leg of it, of course, is that we are facing this problem because of the neglect of the welfare of persons in the health sector, health professionals. And so perhaps it may not be fair to say that, the resident doctors are bringing up these issues at this time. The third point is that this provides an opportunity now for government to retrace its steps and to try to address those grievances. And those grievances, I do not think, are things that government cannot sort out before June 15. One, they are talking about 26 resident doctors at the Jos University Teaching Hospital. It shouldn't be so difficult to reinstate them. They're talking about personal protective equipment. Part of the consignment we just got from Bangladesh included personal protective equipment. And they have a right to ask for that because over almost 900 health professionals have been infected with COVID-19. So it's in their own interest to say that our people should be protected. Salaries, allowances, and all of that can be negotiated. Meanwhile, the federal government, at the briefing yesterday by the Presidential Task Force, has promised that more personal protective equipment will be provided for health professionals. There's also a plan to spend up to about 20 billion naira to take care of arrears of hazard allowances for April, May, and June. So I hope they will do that. And then there's also so much talk about insurance allowance for health professionals. So all of these matters should be resolved because we are facing a serious health crisis. We cannot afford to complicate it further with an industrial relations crisis.
Well, I don't see this as blackmail at all. If you're entering a negotiation, you don't enter it from a position of weakness. You want to negotiate from a position of strength. So this is the best time to get all these issues on the table. And I see, as you've said, nothing unreasonable in what has been demanded here. And I think those demands should be attended to urgently before June 15th.
Right. Okay. In the meantime, about 1/3 of Nigeria's total confirmed COVID-19 cases have now been discharged. According to the latest update from the Nigeria Center for Disease Control, 350 new infections have been confirmed in 13 states and Abuja, bringing the total of confirmed active cases to 12,801. Of this number, 4,040 patients have been discharged. The number of fatalities has also risen from 354 to 361. Lagos has also recorded a spike in its daily toll in the past 24 hours with 128 cases from Monday compared to 38 new cases recorded the day before. The breakdown shows with 128 cases, FCT 34, Rivers 32, Edo 28, Oyo 22, Kaduna 20, Gombe 13, Ogun 8, Plateau 5, Delta 7, Kwara 7, Kano 5, Bauchi 4, and Katsina 2. Another very, very sad one, and I say sad one, was because a lot of people thought it was all Uhuru for Lagos when we saw the numbers a couple of days back. But it looks as though Lagos has leapt forward again, and we are seeing a resurgence of these cases. But obviously, not plateaued yet. We have not even flattened the curve. So we will see figures like this up and down. But another point of note I want to talk about is the unexplained deaths in Kano.
Well, you know, initially when in April there were reports of deaths in Kano, running into over 600 and later close to 1,000. The state governor and the state government and even the health ministry insisted that those deaths were due to hypertension, diabetes, even changing weather. And then, of course, we were told that there would be verbal autopsy. What has now been revealed at the occasion of the press briefing yesterday and 100 days of the first incidence of COVID-19 in Nigeria is that about 70% of those cases, from graveyard reports and from the collation of verbal autopsy reports, are as a result of COVID-19. And I guess that, in a way, will seem to lay the matter to rest and debunk the initial, skepticism of the state government and Kano State stakeholders. However, we're also told that 60% of the fatality rate, will seem to be persons of 65 years and above. What is important is to focus more on Kano and make sure that everything is done to ensure proper case management.
Okay, we'll take a quick break. We'll be right back.
Welcome back to the morning show here on Arise News. Our dependable Rutus Odiri is now here to give us Africa Business Update. Over to you, Rutus. Good morning.
Good morning, Doctor. Good morning, Tundu. Good morning, Rufai. Yes, the World Bank just released its economic global outlook for the rest of 2020. And it's not looking good with regards to, the projections. And we've been here before. We've talked about the IMF projections for the world economy as well as sub-Saharan Africa. So unfortunately, it's more bad news. As you can see there, the World Bank is projecting a contraction for sub-Saharan Africa. Emerging markets, they're looking at a 2.5% contraction, 2.8% contraction for sub-Saharan Africa. The emerging market contraction of 2.5% is the weakest showing in 60 years as far as that projection is concerned. For sub-Saharan Africa, this is the deepest projection on record that they're looking at 2.8%. For Middle East and North Africa, you're looking at a 4.2% contraction. For Nigeria, they're looking at 3.2%. And for South Africa, that just has a myriad of issues. You're looking at a 7.1% contraction. There are multiple headwinds that they've been talking about with regards to the African economies. We know these stories. They listed them again. Weak healthcare systems, a loss of trade and tourism, dwindling remittances coming in from other nations. We've talked about the Global Business Report, for example. Kenya is looking at lower remittances coming from overseas because people overseas are also losing jobs, also being laid off. Subdued capital flows coming into the different economies. The capital flows are going to be reduced. Mounting debt. We've noticed that a number of these African nations have had to borrow more in order to provide a stimulus to their constituencies or to the polity to stave off the effects of COVID-19. So there's a number of headwinds there. We've heard all this before. It's a new report, but again, it's coming from the World Bank. The World Bank is looking at a possible bounce back in the region of 3.1, 3.2% in 2021, but that is only if we don't see a second wave of COVID-19 infections in the second half of the year, and that is only if things can quietly, gradually return back to normal. If not, these projections could actually be worse. On the agricultural side of things, McKinsey released a report looking at African exports. They are projecting that Africa could suffer a loss of $4.8 billion in exports, in lost agricultural exports. They talked about 10 million farmers being affected, between $500 million to $2 billion lost in exports of fruits, vegetables, and nuts. Cocoa exports lost to the tune of $2 billion, $200 million lost in exports of coffee, and $400 million to $600 million lost in flour exports. Looking at Nigeria specifically, the list of issues that we have, and we had a consultant in agriculture on the Global Business Report yesterday. Nigeria has to turn to mechanized farming. We talk about mechanized farming, but there are a number of hiccups that Nigeria's quest for mechanized farming is going to face. One, the cost of acquiring mechanized farming equipment. One new mechanized tractor costs as much as a car or an SUV, or even more. You're looking anywhere from 2 million to 13 million to 20 million just for one. Then there's also the issue of scale. You're before I even get to scale, maintenance, maintaining that in the face of accelerated depreciation of these equipment. Then you've got scaling them, and when I say scale, getting enough of these machines across the 6 geopolitical zones, everywhere where farming takes place. So you got to scale them at cost across the country. And then sufficient training of poorly educated subsistence farmers. Majority of the farming in this country is subsistence. Farmers are basically just fending for themselves. How do you train them enough at scale to where all of them will be able to use these machines? And then the final thing that we need to come to grips with in Nigeria is the loss of jobs as a trade-off for increased productivity. This is a reality we have to face. As you move towards mechanized farming, you will lose jobs. That is to say that you will have less of the number of subsistence farmers that are operating in the country, less of them, because one tractor, one piece of mechanized equipment can do the job of multiple farmers on a particular plot of land. So you have to think about that trade-off in terms of productivity and in terms of jobs. Moving on to oil and gas, Libya made an announcement. They are National Oil Corporation. They made an announcement yesterday that the El Sharara field, which I believe is their largest oil field, is going to be slowly coming back on stream. They're going to be starting out with about 30,000 barrels per day over the next 2 to 3 weeks. And then they're hoping over the next 3 to 4 months, it will ramp up to over 3 million barrels per day. Also, the El Feel field, that's another field that's also been disrupted. Both fields have been disrupted, of course, by the civil unrest that's been going on with different factions in Libya. But they hopefully will be coming back on stream. El Feel, I believe, is going to do about 12,000 barrels per day to start. And over the next 3 to 4 months, they're going to be doing their maximum capacity is about 70,000 barrels per day. This is Libya's oil production. Over the course of the number of years, it has been severely disrupted. You can see it falling, going from a peak of over 1.5 million barrels per day, dropping to under 500,000. So it's been pretty bad, or rather 50,000 rather. It's been pretty bad with regards to the oil and gas, oil production disruptions. The key thing here is, though, this is going to, OPEC is probably not going to be happy about this, because with Libya bringing back their oil on stream, this is now going to add to the supply that is already out in the market. So as you know, OPEC already agreed this past weekend to oil production cuts, and they've asked for everybody to comply. With Libya coming back on stream, that is possibly going to add to more supply and, could disrupt prices and actually bring prices down a bit. I think oil also fell yesterday on the announcement. Finally, Ghana is looking at trying to reduce the dominance of MTN, if you will. I think in the first quarter of the year, January through March in Ghana, MTN was responsible for about 70% of the sector. And so they want to release some kind of legislation that will give more support to other players in the sector. Everybody keeps picking on MTN. It's almost like they're a victim of their own success.
Well, very quickly, I think the point you made about African economies contracting, Well, Africa cannot do it alone. And it's good to see that the World Bank, the IMF, they've been talking about bilateral debt standstill. And we have seen the IMF, the World Bank, and the G7 providing support for African economics. But on our side, in sub-Saharan Africa, our leaders will need to come up with policies that will address sustainable growth, economic diversification, and growth and output. And all of this will be the major challenge for African leaders if they must address the impact of COVID-19, particularly with regard with the fiscal, with the debt crisis that many of these countries face.
Very true, very true.
Well, thank you, Rhodes.
Thank you so much.
Moving on to more business update, Michael Wilson joins us now from London. Good morning, Mr. Wilson.
Good morning. A mixture of the scarred and the scared this morning. Equities rather strangely in a bullish mode. Another record for the Nasdaq. But as Reuters has been saying, these worries, and I'll come on to the World Bank figures in a more global sense later on, worries about economies trying to rebuild. As far as Asia's concerned, first of all, overnight, or at least our overnight, stocks in mainland China, Hong Kong and Australia are up. Australia is playing catch-up because it had a holiday yesterday, and European indices middling to higher, but nothing to write home about yet. An interesting story from Hong Kong for you this morning. We've talked about the Chinese imposing more security demands upon Hong Kong. Its status as, and whatever you think about the hedge fund fraternity, it does provide another weapon in the financial sector. And it's felt that if the Chinese impose further restrictions on Hong Kong, then the community will move to Singapore. It's quite a lot. It's 420 funds in Hong Kong, and they manage more than Japan, Singapore and Australia actually combined. So it's a big business there. One more on Hong Kong. Cathay Pacific, the airline there, will get a $5 billion bailout, which is backed by the Hong Kong government, plus they will also have executive pay cuts there. So another struggling airline story there for you. The European trading session, low volatility yesterday, ebbed and flowed in all sorts of directions. Equity markets slightly upset from comments from the United States. Peter Navarro, who's a trade advisor to the administration there, was saying that China was trying to steal US vaccines through international intellectual property theft. The advisor cautioned that the Chinese might seek to use the pandemic as a way of expanding their own influence throughout the world. But then again, that's just some more noise. But more importantly, Jerome Powell, who's the head of the Federal Reserve, set out this strategy for Main Street lending. You remember we talked about the gap between Wall Street and Main Street. This is a scheme to provide loans for small and medium-sized companies. The minimum loan size, $250,000, maximum $300 million. That's more than the previous guidance talked about, and that's felt to be, it's felt to be just days away. It says from issuing its first loan. So we were talking yesterday again about those better than expected jobs figures on Friday. I did caution that they don't paint a true picture of what's actually going on there. But the fact that the labour markets clawed back some of the jobs that were lost in April, that's helping businesses to reopen. And it means that as far as, well, there's Australia for you, but as far as the S&P is concerned, that managed to finish in positive territory. And as I said, the Nasdaq into a record close there. Fed meeting, Federal Reserve, Central Bank of the United States meeting today and tomorrow.
Sorry to butt in here, but we do need to take a short break. When we return, you can complete your global business update. Please stay with us. Welcome back to the morning show here at Arise News. We're still with Michael Wilson, reporting from London on the Global Business Update.
Thanks so much indeed. Yes, as I was saying, the Central Bank of the United States, Federal Reserve meets today and tomorrow, as it always does, around about this time of the month. And the suspicion is that they will be, as somebody put it to me this morning, speaking from Indonesia, uber dovish. In other words, they will be helping, doing what they can to get the economy going. The UK and Japan begin trade talks today. This is an interesting one. If there's no deal by 2021, of course, January the 1st, that's when Brexit happens as well. It be absolutely that process will be, trade talks will be absolutely finalised there. That World Trade Organisation rules will apply. So what's being pushed here is that there will be a favourable deal with Japan, apparently much more favourable than Japan has with the EU. It's quite a big deal for us, actually. £31 billion a year, 9,500 UK-based companies depend on it. Reuters touched on oil. Yes, indeed, there is that Libyan question. And also, it was clarified that Saudi, the UAE and Kuwait will not be committed to any voluntary production cuts. If you remember over the weekend, as Reuters was saying, OPEC Plus confirmed there will be a continuation of deep production cuts in July. Well, that is beginning to fragment at the moment. And I suspect that news from Libya that he was talking about won't help the oil price today. I've got two other important stories for you very briefly. Shipping. Let's have a spare a thought for those sailors who are stranded in all corners of the world at the moment, and also, just as important, the containers on those ships, which are packed with anything from televisions to clothing, and of course they're arriving at ports now, and there's no consumer demand for them. So it's expected there will be a savage price war as far as shipping's concerned. And as you both know, shipping is a very important indicator of what's happening in global trade. And finally, on that sad note again that Reuters alluded to, that those World Bank and the emerging economies will shrink for the first time in 60 years. 100 million people into extreme poverty. Extreme poverty is people earning less than $1.90 a day, and that includes countries, wait for it, like not just Africa, but Brazil, Russia, India, Latin America, and the Caribbean will face the biggest drops. And this is more pessimistic, as Reuters said, than the April World Bank report, which forecast an overall cut of 3%. This is an overall cut of 5%. So as he began this report by saying, the scarred and the scared are still with us. We have to concentrate on how these economies are going to rebuild themselves. And it's not just about records set in the equity markets, even though that's what happened.
This does give new meaning to health is wealth. But as we round up this section, gentlemen, do you have anything to add?
Well, I mean, it's just that we don't have more time. I was going to ask you about the distress in the shipping industry. It's been there since 2018. So what is responsible for this? COVID-19 mainly, or the fight between China and the United States?
I think both. I think that COVID has actually, of course, intensified everything. It's put a stop to any thoughts of globalization, and whether you like it or not, that's what trade and economies actually depend on these days. So it's a mixture of the two, yeah.
All right, thank you so much, Mr. Wilson there. For updates on COVID-19 pandemic, Aaron Akiri-Jola is here with us. Aaron, what's happening?
Hi, good morning. Good morning to you.
Good morning, Aaron.
Good morning to you. Always nice to hear your voice and see you from the other side.
I thought Rufai gave you a strict warning yesterday.
Probably it just flew over my head. Literally flew over my head. All right, good morning. Let's actually get it started because a lot has actually happened with COVID-19, and this is supposed to be a good news, but at the same time, it's almost turning into a debate right now because the director of technical lead at the WHO yesterday, they actually met, and she actually said, Dr. Maria Van Kerkhove said that I beg your pardon, has spoken and said that patients, as a matter of fact, COVID-19 patients. Rather, it's very rare for asymptomatic patients who have coronavirus to spread the coronavirus. So you look at all this, and that's supposed to be a good news that people would have the coronavirus but do not show symptoms. They are finding from data they've gathered do not spread this particular virus as was claimed earlier. But a particular man talking about Ashish Jha, talking about the Harvard Global Health Institute, who is the director of the Harvard Global Health Institute, has actually refuted that claim and said, as a matter of fact, 40 to 60% of the spread of COVID-19 around the world came from people who did not show symptoms, or people we like to call asymptomatic patients. And at the moment, so it's still a little bit back and forth, and he has cautioned the WHO to be a little bit wary about this particular issue of probably telling people, or probably telling the entire world, that asymptomatic patients rarely transmit the virus to other people. So it's a little bit of back and forth as we look at certain numbers right now, because as we know, the World Health Organization met yesterday and actually cautioned the world and world leaders and spoke to them and said to them that even though we are seeing even though things are actually beginning to ease up, because we're beginning to see economies open left, right, and center, like the ones in India, like the ones in Moscow, also in Belgium, several other countries, including even India, like we spoke about, who are actually having numbers spiral out of control. They are still opening their economies, and he's cautioned these leaders to be very wary and to be cautious and to still ensure that they preach safe distancing, social distancing, all right, hygiene, and every other thing that is needed, that the worst is not behind us. So you look at all this, put it together, and he has actually told world leaders that even though he actually is in line and also encourages the fight against racism, which is actually going on the world over right now, he has actually told everyone that is participating in those protests to be very careful, and not just careful alone, to also endeavor they actually take good care of themselves, wash hands, and ensure that all the guidelines are actually followed. So, but at the moment, what is really sparking an outrage, or what is sparking the confusion, is whether or not pre-symptomatic, as Dr. Jai has called it, he will spread coronavirus, or if asymptomatic people do not spread coronavirus at the moment.
I find it really difficult to accept that asymptomatic patients cannot spread the virus, because the virus is spread through droplets, right? If you're asymptomatic, you're not going to be coughing or sneezing, but you could pass it on by speaking and sharing crockery or cutlery. You are still infectious.
I mean, the jury's out on the science on this, and like I normally tell people, COVID is something we are all just trying to understand in the world. You'll have seen a lot of pushbacks, even with wearing face masks. You'll see that it took the World Health Organization some time before they could make a stance as regards the use of face masks. So the jury is out on the science, but one thing is certain. Many months down the line, we'll get to understand the science even better. I mean, still speaking about the science, there was even a report that I read in The Economist that's talking about the fact that smokers have a better way of fighting the virus. And a lot of people will have been shocked by just hearing that.
But I don't believe everything you don't believe everything you read. Some things are counterintuitive, some things make no sense whatsoever.
But it was a very scientific proof that was even corroborated by The Economist about the fact that there were certain cells and peptides that smokers had at which to fight COVID.
Which next week will be refuted and rubbish.
So the jury's out on the science.
I think the key point that has been made is that there is no definitive answer yet as to the nature of the virus. And that point was well made by Maria Kekove after making the point about the research that was carried out, and they reached the conclusion that asymptomatic persons may not really be super spreaders. But as you pointed out, there is the alternative view that, this is not quite true. And that was the position of the director of the Global Health Institute at Harvard.
Yes,
yeah, but I think the more important point is a statement by the Director General of the WHO himself that, leaders should not take their foot off the pedal. That was how he put it, because we don't know how this virus is shaping out yet. And I also find interesting the point he made about the people who are protesting against racism. And he says, yes, he supports the anti-racism protest, but that people should try to observe the basic protocols about COVID-19. And he was even recommending 1 meter physical distancing. And I was wondering whether 1 meter would be enough. because what we've been told is that it must be a minimum of 2 meters.
Yeah, 2 meters.
So I was quite surprised that Dr. Ghebreyesus is now talking about 1 meter.
He's trying to just be realistic here.
But for me, I don't want anybody thinking that this report gives them carte blanche to go prancing around because they're asymptomatic. You still need to self-isolate.
True.
But you carry on, Aaron.
All right, before we actually move on, let's look at the global figures at the moment. And of this morning, well over 7,121,126 are the number of confirmed cases of COVID-19 as of this morning, with deaths of 406,570. Now, looking at Africa, the African figure at the moment actually, because we've been looking at South Africa, we've been speaking about South Africa, and at the moment, South Africa has actually crossed the 50,000 mark in terms of confirmed cases of COVID-19. We'll get to see the breakdown on our screen in a matter of moments. And okay, let's first talk about Africa. As we near the 200,000 confirmed cases, at the moment is 195,875 with 5,334 deaths. Now, moving on to South Africa, because like I have been saying all week, all right, there's been a major spike in the southern part of Africa as they still are easing lockdown. All right, 50,879 are the number of confirmed cases as of yesterday evening. All right, with total recoveries of 26,099 with 1,080 deaths. And of course, you can actually see they're very impressive. They've tested almost 1 million people. The exact number, 59 patients have been tested. And just yesterday, 2,594 new cases were recorded. And Western Cape province still has the most number at the moment in South Africa in terms of deaths recorded in that particular land of sun. And it's still kind of worrying, but at the moment, with things spiraling out of control in South Africa, Cyril Ramaphosa still being twisted with the recession that is looming and what is actually going on in the economy, that is still insistent, and they are still going ahead to open schools, even though people are protesting, and not just open schools alone, they are still going on to open the economy.
Thank you, Aaron.
Always a pleasure.
Update.